Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for over 12 years, and he thought he had seen everything. The unexpected answers, the family drama, the moments of pure joy and occasional disappointment. But on a humid Thursday afternoon in June 2024, something happened that would make him stop the game completely, put down his cards, and deliver a message that would be replayed millions of times across social media and news outlets around the world. If you love stories about standing up for what is right and watching someone get the reality check they desperately need, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss moments like this. The Thompson family from Nashville, Tennessee, stood on one side of the stage facing the Rodriguez family from Miami, Florida. Both families had made it through the audition process, traveled to the studio in Atlanta, and were ready to compete for the $20,000 grand prize. The Thompsons were led by their patriarch James Thompson, a 58-year-old insurance executive who carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from years of being the decision-maker in every room he entered. Standing next to him was his wife, Patricia Thompson, a 55-year-old woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that seemed to shrink slightly whenever her husband spoke. Patricia had been a registered nurse for 32 years. She had worked night shifts in the emergency room, held the hands of dying patients, saved lives with her quick thinking and steady hands, and raised 3 children while maintaining a career that demanded everything from her. But watching her stand next to her husband on that Family Feud stage, you would never know the strength and courage her profession required. She stood with her shoulders slightly hunched, her smile hesitant, always glancing at James before she spoke as if seeking permission or approval. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her blouse, a nervous habit that revealed years of conditioning to make herself smaller in his presence. The game had been progressing normally through the first 2 rounds. The Thompsons were winning by a comfortable margin with James dominating the gameplay. He was loud, confident, and quick with his answers. Every time he got points for his family, he would turn to the audience and pump his fist like he had just won the Super Bowl. Steve Harvey had been playing along with James's energy, feeding into the competitive banter that made for good television. But there was something about the dynamic between James and Patricia that had been bothering Steve from the beginning, something he could not quite name but could definitely feel. The way Patricia seemed to fade into the background whenever James spoke, the way she second-guessed herself before answering, the way her whole body language screamed a lifetime of being told she was not quite good enough. The trouble started during the 3rd round when it was Patricia's turn at the podium. The question was about courage and inner strength, topics that should have been perfectly suited to someone with Patricia's background and experience. Steve read it with his characteristic enthusiasm, his voice booming through the studio. The survey said to name something that takes courage to do every day. Patricia thought for a moment, her face concentrating as she considered her answer. You could see her mentally running through options, weighing which response might be on the board, trying to find the perfect answer that would make her family proud and contribute to their victory. Finally, she spoke with quiet conviction that came from 3 decades of lived experience. Patricia said going to work and taking care of sick people when you are scared yourself takes courage. It was a thoughtful answer, one that clearly came from her own experience as an emergency room nurse who had faced countless frightening situations while maintaining her professional composure. The answer revealed something about her character, her empathy, and her understanding that courage was not just about grand gestures, but about showing up every day even when you were afraid. It was the kind of answer that came from someone who truly understood what bravery looked like in real life, not in movies or books but in the daily grind of helping people during their worst moments. Steve nodded appreciatively at the answer, clearly recognizing the depth of thought behind it and prepared to check the board. But before he could reveal whether it was there, James Thompson's voice cut across the stage like a knife. The comment was loud enough for everyone to hear, delivered with a dismissive laugh that suggested he found his wife's answer somehow amusing or inadequate. James said that was such a weak answer and that Patricia always overthought everything instead of just going with the obvious choice. He rolled his eyes as he said it, a gesture so casual and practiced that you knew this was not the first time he had dismissed his wife's thoughts and contributions. He turned to the audience as if expecting them to laugh along with him, to join him in mocking his wife's supposed inadequacy. The studio audience did not laugh. Instead, they reacted with an uncomfortable murmur, a collective intake of breath that signaled they recognized this was not the usual family teasing that often happened on the show. This was something else, something that carried an edge of genuine contempt. Patricia's face flushed red with embarrassment, the color spreading from her neck to her cheeks. Her shoulders hunched even further as if she were trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear from the spotlight that had suddenly become unbearably harsh. You could see her blinking rapidly, fighting back tears, trying to maintain her composure in front of the cameras and the studio audience. Steve Harvey's expression changed immediately. The smile that had been playing on his face disappeared, replaced by something harder and more serious. His jaw set in a firm line, and his eyes narrowed as he looked at James Thompson with an intensity that anyone who had watched Steve's career knew meant something significant was about to happen. Steve did not check the board. He did not move to the next question. He did not try to smooth over the moment with a joke or redirect the energy of the game. Instead, he put his question cards down on his podium with deliberate slowness, the gesture commanding everyone's attention. The sound of those cards hitting the wooden surface echoed through the suddenly silent studio. Steve said he needed everyone to hold on for just a minute because something just happened that needed to be addressed right now. The casual energy of the game show evaporated instantly. The studio audience fell completely silent, the kind of silence that happens when people sense that something important and real is about to occur. The production crew in the booth exchanged worried glances, uncertain whether to cut to commercial or let whatever was about to happen play out. The director's voice could be heard faintly through someone's earpiece, asking what was happening and whether they should intervene. James Thompson's confident smile faltered slightly as he realized that Steve was not moving forward with the game, that his comment had triggered something unexpected. Steve walked away from his podium and moved to the center of the stage, positioning himself where he could address both the families and the studio audience directly. His movements were measured and purposeful, each step carrying the weight of a decision to prioritize truth and respect over entertainment and comfort. His voice when he spoke carried the authority of someone who had decided that this moment was more important than the show format, more important than keeping things light and entertaining, more important than avoiding confrontation. Steve said he had been doing this show for a long time and he had heard families tease each other and joke around, and that was all part of the fun. But what James just said to his wife was not teasing and it was not joking. That was disrespect, and Steve said he was not going to let it slide without saying something about it. The audience erupted in applause, a wave of support that seemed to validate what many of them had been feeling since James made his comment. People stood up, clapping not just politely but with genuine enthusiasm and appreciation for Steve's willingness to stop the show and address what they had all witnessed. James tried to interrupt, clearly uncomfortable with being called out on national television in front of his family and millions of potential viewers. He started to say that Steve was taking it too seriously and that he was just kidding around with his wife, that this was how they always talked to each other and she knew he did not mean anything by it. His voice carried a defensive edge, the tone of someone who was used to having his behavior excused or overlooked. But Steve held up his hand, and the authority in that simple gesture was enough to stop James mid-sentence. Steve had the microphone, the platform, and the moral high ground, and James Thompson was about to receive an education in respect that was long overdue. Steve turned to Patricia with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the firmness he had just shown her husband. He asked her directly how long she had been a nurse, his voice conveying genuine interest and respect. Patricia seemed surprised to be addressed directly, surprised that someone was actually interested in her answer rather than dismissing it or talking over her. She looked at Steve with wide eyes, then at her husband, then back at Steve. When she spoke, her voice was soft at first, barely audible even with the microphone. She said that she had been a nurse for 32 years, working mostly in emergency rooms and intensive care units. Steve nodded encouragingly and asked her to tell everyone what that job actually involved, what it required from her on a daily basis. He was not just making conversation or filling time. He was creating space for Patricia to be seen and heard, to have her expertise and experience acknowledged in a way that clearly had not happened often enough in her life. Patricia's voice was hesitant at first, the words coming slowly as if she was not used to talking about herself or her accomplishments. But as she spoke, something remarkable began to happen. Her voice grew stronger, her posture straightened. The woman who had seemed so diminished just moments before began to emerge. She explained that being an emergency room nurse meant you never knew what was coming through those doors. You might have to handle a car accident victim with multiple traumatic injuries, a child with a life-threatening illness whose parents were terrified and looking to you for reassurance, a shooting victim whose life was measured in minutes, or someone having a massive heart attack who needed immediate intervention. You had to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, decisions that carried weight and consequences that would follow you home at night. She talked about the technical skills required, the ability to start IVs in patients whose veins had collapsed from shock, to intubate someone who had stopped breathing, to perform chest compressions during codes while maintaining the stamina to keep going for as long as it took. She described the mental calculations happening constantly, tracking multiple patients, remembering medication dosages, watching for subtle signs that someone was crashing before the monitors even registered the change. She spoke about the emotional intelligence needed to comfort terrified family members while simultaneously performing life-saving procedures, to de-escalate violent or intoxicated patients, to deliver terrible news with compassion even when you had 3 other critical patients waiting. Patricia talked about the times she had held patients' hands as they died because their families had not arrived yet, becoming the last human connection for people who were leaving this world. She spoke about the babies she had tried to save, the teenagers who had made terrible mistakes and paid with their lives, the elderly patients who coded in her arms despite her best efforts. She described the weight of those losses, the way they accumulated over years, the faces she could still see when she closed her eyes at night. She spoke about the COVID-19 pandemic when she went to work every single day knowing she might get sick, knowing she might bring the virus home to her own family, but going anyway because people needed her, and because walking away was not something her conscience would allow. She talked about the fear that lived in her chest during those months, the way she would sit in her car in the hospital parking lot before each shift and have to talk herself into walking through those doors. She described watching colleagues get sick, some of them dying, while she continued to show up because someone had to take care of the patients who kept coming in wave after wave. She described the physical demands of 12-hour shifts that often stretched to 14 or 16 hours when the department was understaffed or when a mass casualty event brought in dozens of patients at once. She talked about the exhaustion that went bone deep, the way your feet hurt and your back ached and your hands cramped from all the procedures and paperwork. She spoke about skipping meals and bathroom breaks because the patients needed constant attention, about the dehydration and hunger that became so familiar you stopped noticing them. Patricia talked about the emotional toll of losing patients despite your best efforts, of second-guessing every decision, of wondering if you had missed something or if there was something else you could have done. She described the mental strength required to come back the next day and do it all over again, to walk back into that emergency room and give everything you had to the next group of patients, even though you knew some of them would not make it no matter what you did. She spoke about the nightmares, the hypervigilance that made it hard to relax even on days off, the way your mind was always running through emergency scenarios and worst-case possibilities. As Patricia spoke, something remarkable happened that everyone in the studio could see and feel. Her posture changed dramatically. Her shoulders straightened and pulled back. Her chin lifted. Her voice grew clearer and more confident with each sentence. The woman who had seemed so diminished standing next to her husband was transforming before everyone's eyes into someone who commanded respect and admiration. The studio audience was completely silent, hanging on every word, many of them with tears in their eyes as they recognized the courage and dedication that Patricia's career represented. Some people were nodding along, recognizing their own experiences or those of loved ones who worked in healthcare. When she finished speaking, Steve turned to James Thompson with an expression that combined disappointment and barely controlled anger. His voice was low and intense when he spoke, carrying more weight than if he had shouted. Steve said that Patricia had just described a career that required more courage, more strength, and more mental toughness than most people would ever have to demonstrate in their entire lives. She had literally saved lives, made impossible decisions under pressure that would have paralyzed most people, and shown up every day to do work that would break the average person within weeks. Steve's voice got louder as he continued, filling the studio with righteous indignation on Patricia's behalf. He said that for James to stand there and call his wife weak, to dismiss her thoughtful answer as inadequate, to belittle her in front of millions of people showed a fundamental lack of respect that was genuinely disturbing. Steve said he did not care how long they had been married or what their dynamic was at home. That behavior was unacceptable and James needed to understand that right now. There was no joking in Steve's tone, no attempt to soften the message. This was a man using his platform to defend someone who clearly had not been defended often enough in her life. The audience exploded in applause again, this time even louder and longer than before. People were on their feet, not just clapping but cheering for Steve's willingness to call out the disrespect they had all witnessed. The sound was thunderous, filling the studio with the collective voice of people who were tired of seeing women's contributions minimized and dismissed. James's face had gone from confident to red with embarrassment and anger. You could see him struggling between doubling down on his position and recognizing that he had severely miscalculated the situation. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and his jaw worked as he tried to decide how to respond. Steve was not finished. He turned back to Patricia with his expression softening and asked her if this was how her husband regularly spoke to her, if this dismissive attitude was a pattern in their relationship or just a one-time mistake brought on by competition stress. Patricia looked at James, then at Steve, and you could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. She was clearly not accustomed to speaking up about her marriage, not used to having someone in a position of authority validate her feelings and experiences and ask her directly about the reality of her life. Patricia said quietly that sometimes James got frustrated with her because she was not as quick or as confident as he was, and she knew she tended to overthink things instead of just making fast decisions. She said he was a successful businessman who made rapid-fire choices all day long, and she understood that her more careful approach probably seemed slow or indecisive to him. But even as she made these excuses for her husband's behavior, her voice carried an undertone of resignation that suggested she had been making these excuses for a very long time, that she had internalized his criticism, and come to believe that maybe she really was too slow, too careful, too weak. Steve shook his head firmly and said that what Patricia called overthinking, other people called being thoughtful and careful and conscientious. He said that in her profession, taking time to consider options and think through consequences was not a weakness, It was a critical skill that saved lives every single day. He pointed out that the medical field valued nurses precisely because they were detail-oriented, because they caught things doctors might miss, because they took the time to really understand their patients as whole human beings rather than just collections of symptoms to be treated. Then Steve did something unexpected that would become one of the most powerful moments of the episode. He asked the Rodriguez family, their competitors who should have been hoping for the Thompsons to fail, what they thought about Patricia's original answer about courage. Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman in her early 60s who had been watching the entire exchange with visible emotion and tears streaming down her face, spoke up immediately without hesitation. She said that as someone who had family members in the medical field, including a daughter who was a nurse and a son who was a doctor, she knew exactly the kind of courage it took to do that work every single day. She said Patricia's answer was not weak at all. It was profound and true and came from real lived experience, and it deserved respect and recognition. She said that if she had been asked that question, she would have given a superficial answer about skydiving or public speaking. But Patricia had given an answer that revealed real understanding of what courage actually meant in everyday life. The other Thompson family members, their adult children, looked uncomfortable as this confrontation continued. They were standing behind their parents, and you could see from their expressions that this public confrontation was revealing dynamics they had probably witnessed at home for years, but had never felt empowered to address. One of the daughters had tears streaming down her face, her hand covering her mouth as if holding back words she had wanted to say for decades. The son was staring at his father with an expression that mixed embarrassment with what looked like long-suppressed frustration, and perhaps even relief that someone was finally calling out behavior he had seen directed at his mother his entire life. Steve turned back to James and said something that would become one of the most quoted moments from the episode, a statement that would be shared across social media platforms and discussed in relationship counseling sessions for years to come. He said that strength came in many forms, and sometimes the strongest people were those who showed up every day to do difficult work without needing to announce their toughness to everyone around them, without needing to dominate conversations or put others down to feel powerful. He said that Patricia going to work for 32 years, saving lives and comforting the dying, raising children and maintaining her compassion and kindness despite all the trauma she witnessed, that was strength. That was real strength, not the loud, dominating, dismissive behavior that some people mistook for confidence or leadership. Steve continued by saying that anyone could be loud, anyone could put others down to feel bigger, anyone could dismiss their partner's contributions and thoughts. But it took real strength, real character to build someone up, to recognize their gifts even when they were different from your own, to celebrate your partner's thoughtfulness instead of criticizing it. He said that true confidence did not require making others feel small, and true strength was about lifting people up rather than pushing them down. The camera caught James Thompson's face as Steve spoke these words, and you could see something shifting behind his eyes. Whether it was genuine realization or just the discomfort of being publicly corrected in front of millions of people, something was changing in his expression. The defensive anger was giving way to what looked like shame and perhaps the beginning of real understanding. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he looked down at the floor, unable to meet Steve's eyes or the gaze of the studio audience or even his own family members. Steve gave him a choice in that moment, an opportunity to decide what kind of man he wanted to be going forward. He said they could continue the game, but only if James was prepared to treat his wife with the respect she deserved, not just for the rest of the game but for the rest of their lives together. He said that if James could not commit to that, they should end the game right now because Steve was not interested in facilitating more disrespect on his stage. The studio was silent as everyone waited to see how James would respond to this ultimatum. James Thompson stood there in front of millions of viewers with his bravado completely deflated, stripped of the confidence and swagger that had characterized his performance up to that point. And then he did something that many people did not expect given his earlier behavior. He turned to his wife with tears forming in his eyes and apologized. His voice broke as he said he was sorry for calling her weak, sorry for dismissing her answer, and sorry for the way he had been treating her not just on the show but throughout their marriage. He said she was right to take her time with answers because she thought about things more carefully than he did, and that was something he should appreciate and value rather than criticize and diminish. James said that watching her describe her career and realizing how much courage and strength it actually required had made him see how wrong he had been, not just in this moment but for years. He admitted that he had been threatened by her competence and intelligence, and instead of celebrating those qualities, he had tried to make her doubt herself so he could feel superior. His voice was thick with emotion as he acknowledged the harm he had caused and the years of dismissive behavior that had damaged their relationship and hurt not just his wife but their children who had to watch this dynamic play out. Patricia stood there looking at her husband with an expression that was complex and layered, reflecting 3 decades of marriage and all the love and pain and disappointment and hope that came with that history. Tears were running down her face, and you could see her processing this public apology, this acknowledgement of her worth that she had been waiting years to hear. She did not say anything at first, just stood there with tears running down her face, her hands pressed to her chest as if trying to hold in the emotions that were threatening to overwhelm her. Then she nodded slowly, accepting his apology with the grace and compassion that seemed to define her character even after years of not receiving the same grace in return. She said quietly that she knew he loved her and she loved him, but that love had to include respect and appreciation, not just in big moments but in everyday interactions. She said she was willing to work on their marriage, but things had to change, and she needed him to mean what he was saying right now and not just be caught up in the emotion of the moment. Steve Harvey wiped his own eyes, moved by the vulnerability and honesty playing out in front of him. He said that this was what the show was really about, not just answering questions and winning money, but families learning to treat each other with love and respect and dignity. He said he was proud of James for being willing to apologize publicly and acknowledge his mistakes, and he was proud of Patricia for standing tall and letting her strength show through, for not minimizing her own worth or making excuses for behavior that was not acceptable. Then Steve made a decision that surprised everyone in the studio and would surprise viewers when the episode aired. He announced that regardless of how the game ended, he was personally going to make sure that Patricia's answer was recognized as valuable and important. He revealed the board, and while her specific wording was not there, a similar answer about facing fear at work was the #2 response with significant points. Steve said that in his book, Patricia's answer was #1 and he was counting it as such. The audience erupted in agreement, standing and applauding again. The game continued, but the dynamic had completely changed. The competitive edge had softened into something more collaborative and supportive. James was quieter, more thoughtful, and every time Patricia answered a question, he was supportive and encouraging rather than critical. He would nod approvingly when she spoke, touch her arm gently in support, and smile at her with what looked like genuine appreciation and newfound respect. Their children stood behind them with visible relief on their faces, as if a weight they had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. When the Thompsons won the game and the $20,000, James immediately said that Patricia should decide how to spend the money because she had earned it through her hard work and dedication to their family all these years. He said that he had been taking her contributions for granted, and it was time he started recognizing and honoring everything she did. Patricia suggested they use some of the money for a family vacation where they could all reconnect and start building healthier patterns together, and the rest would go toward their children's futures. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, the response was overwhelming and immediate. The clip of Steve stopping the game to call out James's disrespect went viral within hours, spreading across every social media platform. Mental health professionals praised Steve for recognizing and addressing what they identified as a pattern of emotional abuse that often went unrecognized because it did not involve physical violence. They pointed out that consistently calling a partner weak or dismissing their intelligence was a form of psychological abuse that could be just as damaging as physical harm. Nurses and other healthcare workers flooded social media with their own stories of having their work and worth diminished by partners, family members, or society at large. They shared experiences of being told they were just nurses, as if their expertise and dedication were less valuable than other professions. They talked about partners who minimized the trauma they experienced at work or who complained when they were too emotionally drained to take care of home responsibilities after a shift where they had watched people die. Women's advocacy groups used the clip as an example of why it was important for people in positions of influence to call out disrespectful behavior when they saw it, rather than letting it slide in the name of keeping things comfortable or avoiding conflict. They emphasized that Steve Harvey's intervention showed how bystanders and people with platforms could make a real difference by refusing to normalize behaviors that diminished women. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell so you do not miss more powerful stories like this one. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought about Steve's decision to stop the game, or share a time when someone stood up for you when you needed it most. The Thompson family did interviews in the months following the episode, speaking openly about their journey. James talked about how that moment on Family Feud had forced him to confront behavior patterns he had developed over decades, patterns that came from his own insecurities and his father's example. He talked about going to therapy, both individual and couples counseling, to understand why he felt the need to diminish his wife's contributions and intelligence. He acknowledged that his behavior had damaged their relationship and hurt their children who had grown up watching their father disrespect their mother. Patricia talked about finding her voice again after years of making herself smaller to accommodate her husband's ego and his need to feel superior. She said that having Steve Harvey, a man her husband respected and admired, publicly validate her worth and call out the disrespect had given her permission to expect better treatment. She started setting boundaries at home, speaking up when she felt dismissed, and demanding the respect she deserved. She said it was not always easy and there were setbacks, but the overall trajectory of their relationship had improved dramatically. Their adult children spoke about how the public nature of the confrontation had actually helped their family heal in ways that private conversations never had. They said that issues they had tried to address with their father for years were finally being taken seriously because they had been exposed and validated by someone outside the family dynamic. The daughter who had cried during the episode said she had spent her whole life watching her father belittle her mother and had unconsciously started accepting similar treatment in her own relationships. Seeing her mother stand tall and be defended had helped her recognize that she deserved better too, and she had ended a relationship with a boyfriend who had been exhibiting similar dismissive behaviors. Years later, people still talk about the episode where Steve Harvey stopped Family Feud to defend a nurse. The story has become part of the broader cultural conversation about respect in relationships and the importance of using platforms for good rather than just entertainment.